You're listening to episode 86 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Donald Altman, author of The Mindfulness Code, speaks with us about his new book, 1 Minute Mindfulness, and Mindful Eating. One of the most daunting aspects of our meditation practice is just how long it takes, particularly as beginners. Often, the most difficult meditation session is the very first time we try to sit mindfully for 10 minutes. If we persevere, we work our way up to longer sessions, start going on day-long retreats, then weekends, 10 days, month-long retreats, and longer. But sometimes, even just remembering to take a minute for basic mindfulness is our biggest hurdle. Passing that can lead to wonderful changes in our minds, how we interact with others, and even some of our deep-seated biological cravings. Donald Altman is a psychotherapist, award-winning writer, former Buddhist monk, and teacher. An adjunct professor at Lewis and Clark Graduate School of Education and Counseling, he teaches a class on the contemplative dimension in education and counseling. He is also a faculty member of the Interpersonal Neurobiology program at Portland State University and teaches various classroom blending mindfulness and interpersonal neurobiology. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice shome white tea. And my guest today is Donald Altman. Donald, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Ted. Thanks for having me on.
I'm very glad to have you here. I got a really nice note from Kim Corbin, who is a publicist working with your publisher that I'd spoken with before, and we did the interview with Brad Warner. And she said, Ted, you might like to take a look at this other book that's just come out, 1 Minute Mindfulness by Donald Altman. And I have it in hand here, and I've been reading it. It's a very nice book. And what I'd like to do before we chat about that is find out a little bit more about you. Would you tell us about your background and how you first encountered meditation?
Thank you for asking that. And it was kind of a roundabout path, and maybe that will kind of resonate with some of your listeners. I've been interested in exploring meditation when I was younger. I remember in college there was the Silva method, and I remember I went to a TM introduction and never followed that up. But I did do some different readings, Krishnamurti and different spiritual teachers, and had done some meditation on my own. So I was very interested in it. Then in the 90s, the mid-90s, I was going through a kind of a tough time in my life, and had a business that went through an abrupt end. And around that time it was kind of interesting, and I was really looking for some way to deal with the difficulties in my life at that time. And a friend of mine who'd known I was interested in meditation, and said, there's a monk I would like you to meet. And I was up in San Francisco, yeah.
Not
Yeah,
often we get to hear that
don't,
phrase. There's a monk I'd like you to meet.
yeah, not that often, huh? And so I was curious about that more than anything else. And so I was up in San Francisco, and she said, "Why, Uthilananda, that was his name." She said, "He's here," and I had a brief meeting with him. He was a Theravadan monk. Yeah, he was a wonderful man, and it was just that meeting with him, that brief meeting with him, that I remember thinking to myself, I could sense the compassion and the availability and openness of this man, and something in me said, how I had never met anybody like that in our culture, and I thought, how did somebody get to be like that? And I found out later, and I had gone to a couple of sittings with some other Theravadan monks, and I found out that I could ordain with Uthilananda being the Sayadaw, or the head of this monastery. It would be a brief period of time that I would ordain, and so I did that, and that's when while I was in the monastery, I read his book, The Four Foundations of Mindfulness, and I remember when one of the monks said, "I want you to sit across from Uthilananda," I was kind of nervous about that because he was going to watch me eat. And one of the reasons that I went into the monastery, interestingly enough, was I had a lot of struggles with food and eating moderately, and I was very much an emotional eater. And so being able to sit and learn about mindfulness and to deal with my own struggle with food and to understand. In fact, when I went in, this is kind of a funny story. Before I went in that afternoon to ordain, I knew that the monks would, wake up very early in the morning, about 3:30 in the morning. You'd have a small meal from 6:30 to 7 for breakfast. You would have lunch from 11 to 12, and you wouldn't eat out for the rest of the day. And I knew that was going to be a big challenge for me. So before I went in that afternoon, I stopped at one of my favorite restaurants and had this huge meal. If you think you're going to have to go on some kind of a diet, right? So I got there and went through this incredible ceremony of ordination. And it was just the first lesson they have. Of course, they shave your hair off, and they hold it up in front of you, and then one of the monks says, "This is not you." And
thank goodness, because there's less and less of me every year.
Letting go of attachment. And so I went through this ceremony, and I'm walking back with my I had this black alms bowl, and I'm wearing the saffron robes. And I stopped in the bathroom just to wash my face off. And I looked in the mirror and I saw myself without any hair. And I said, who invited Uncle Fester in here? From the Uncle Festus, or what I don't know his name was, from the
Fester.
Addams family.
Oh, you got it right. Uncle Fester from the Addams family. Yep.
Uncle Fester, yeah. And so I went to the room with two other new monks, and this was a room with 3 futons, and I sat down on that. And I'm sitting cross-legged in these robes, and all of a sudden it hit me like, well, what have I done? This was
seemed like a good idea at the time. But...
Yeah, it really did. And then something caught my attention. I look over, and there's a shelving unit. I guess they used this room for some storage as well. And there, about 1.5 feet from my nose, is a giant Cadbury's chocolate bar. And this was exactly the struggle that I'm having, of course, with food. And I had an inner struggle. My mind was at war with itself. And I looked over at one of the monks. I had, wanted this chocolate bar to really soothe and calm myself in this moment of transition. And at the same time, I had taken this vow not to eat after 12 noon. So there was this war going on, and I couldn't do what we normally do in our culture. Couldn't just distract myself or go get that chocolate bar, or, I had to deal with it. So I looked over and I saw one monk was doing he was counting his rosary beads and meditating with that. And another monk was crashed out. And I thought to myself for a moment there, I had that thought, well, nobody would know.
I could sneak it. I could sneak a Cadbury.
Yeah, I could take it. But so I sat there. I just sat there, and here were these competing thoughts. And after a long period of time, being present with my mind and really watching it for the first time in this way, after maybe an hour and a half, all of a sudden something shifted, and I was observing the thoughts, and it stunned me. It was as if I was just this neutral observer watching this drama. And I realized in that moment that I could honor my vows not to eat, and I could also honor the thoughts and not take them so personally that I was having about wanting the food, this kind of wounded emotional part of myself. And so that was one of the big lessons, the beginning of my journey, and then learning mindfulness, how to be present moment by moment with expanding your awareness into the body and into the senses, into the mind, the emotions, and even contemplating the Dharma and what is wholesome, what is good, and that I got more centered with that in the monastery. And when I left there, and I went in a couple of times, and I also wrote one of my first spiritual-oriented books, Art of the Inner Meal, which is about eating, and while I was in the monastery. So the monks, their kindness and what I learned from Uthilananda, I say I left the monastery, but it's still in my heart, and that will never leave me. And and so then when I got out of the monastery, I started doing workshops on spiritual eating. How do you connect with food and change your relationship in a more connected and spiritual, deep way? And what happened was people would come to me and they'd say, after the workshops were over, and they'd come over and kind of in a hushed voice tell me about some really devastating eating disorder they had that I was not prepared to work with them with. I then, as a result of my journey into the monastery, went back to school. I went to graduate school at Lewis and Clark Graduate School of Counseling and Education up in Portland. I got a master's in counseling psychology. I worked in an eating clinic, eating disorder clinic at a hospital for 3.5 years, and then started writing more books on eating with mindfulness. And then I started writing other books and broadening that out just into more general mindfulness and to helping people find. My whole thing was to expand the vocabulary, to make it more accessible to the everyday person out there who I could see was really suffering from the stresses and the demands of our culture and expectations in at the workplace, and that they needed some way to get centered and some way to find relief. And many of them were maybe too frightened with the M word, whether meditation or mindfulness, but I knew they would benefit from a breathing practice. I knew they would benefit from starting to watch their minds more. And so I started to broaden the vocabulary and try to, and try to be less adhering to the Buddhist traditional terminology, and to make it accessible for really for the Westerner, for Americans.
Right. And that's it exactly. And we were chatting about this a little bit before the interview started, that your approach, like more and more that we are seeing growing, is one of it's not disparaging our traditional Buddhist roots. We do still have that, and these principles are very much valid. It's that the jargon, the terminology, the Pali terms don't resonate with people who have not already adopted that kind of willingness to investigate traditional Buddhism. And in order to share this perfectly valid practice with them, it's okay for us to look at, well, what do these things mean to us in our contemporary Western culture? What are the words that resonate in the same way?
The ideas that are in the traditional Buddhist practices, they're in Sanskrit and Pali, and also if you go to certain Buddhist temples, there's a whole religious devotional aspect. Somebody may not want to buy into that religious framework, and so in the way that I'm promoting it it's not. It's really ways to integrate centering and focused awareness in your life in a beneficial way, and meaning also. And so it doesn't matter which religious tradition you have. This can be inclusive or included in that tradition.
Exactly, and that's what secular Buddhism is about, is not a shunning of traditional practices. It's expanding this for portability to people who would really benefit from it, who may not be willing to adopt a religious tradition that is not their own, or people who are of no religion. Those of us who are atheists also can participate in this and gain some positive benefit from it. I did want to say, Donald, you had mentioned a couple of times in this that you've struggled with some eating challenges, and I see that you're a board member on the Center for Mindful Eating, and I just wanted to share with the listeners that if they're interested in finding out more about that, and that is a struggle they have or someone they know has, there is a website for that, and that's tcme.org, the Center for Mindful Eating, TCME, Tom, Charlie, Mabel, Edward.org. Go take a look there, and you'll find some resources that may help with that.
Yeah, I think it's a very valuable organization. It's a nonprofit, and actually I'm the vice president of the Center for Mindful Eating now, and I am really excited that we're going to be creating a new website there. And we also work with professionals a lot, helping professionals. But any person can come to the site, and we do have open teleconferences that anyone can listen in on. So, thank you for mentioning that, and I invite your audience to join us at tcme.org.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks for setting that up. I know that there are people who do struggle with this, and you yourself, having gone through it, you really do understand that from the perspective of the experience itself. And that makes you terrifically valuable as a resource for people who are struggling with it now. You've also written a book just before the one we're actually here to talk about, The Mindfulness Code. Why don't you tell us just a little bit about that as well?
Okay. Yeah, The Mindfulness Code was a book that I wrote, which, again, was expanding that mindfulness vocabulary, but looking at some of the science behind mindfulness research. And there's a lot of brain research about mindfulness now. It's really fascinating. So that book combines anecdotes from my own work as a therapist, my own stories from my own life, along with brain science and mindfulness research. So that, because, again, people, I think, in our culture are very scientifically oriented, and they want to know, well, how does this really work? So when I talk about the breathing, I actually talk about the physiology and the vagus nerve and what happens to the whole, the body's stress system and the neurotransmitters. So it is kind of fascinating. That book goes into a lot of that information, and but also really explores what I call the catalyzing elements of mindfulness: intention, centering, attention, and the now, and talking about how those all work together. And then I help people explore mindfulness through different pathways, through the mind, through the body, through relationships, and through nature and spirituality. So those are the kind of the four doorways through which people can, and those are the four sections in the book, actually, and so it helps people use that as kind of their, that's their journey through the book. And that book, actually, I'm very proud to say that book, I think it's reaching a lot of people, and I got a lot of emails from people around the world, actually, telling me how different parts of that book changed their life. And I think what we underestimate often is how, and that's why I do this work, is that to get this material out there is to help people realize that something as simple as the breath can really be very profound.
And I'd like to remind the listeners that that book and the one we will be talking about in a moment, there will be links on the episode page for this episode to both of them. So just go to that and you'll be able to find them. Make it easy for you. What I would like to talk now, moving on to 1 minute mindfulness. We have a subtitle on here of 50 Simple Ways to Find Peace, Clarity, and New Possibilities in a Stressed Out World. Donald, tell us what made you decide to write this particular 1 minute focus book on mindfulness?
Yeah, I think what happened is kind of the evolution of my work, and I think that after I did the mindfulness code, I wanted to write a book that was just very, very practical. That somebody can pick up and start accessing mindfulness in a very approachable way, an integrative way, and start to awaken to possibilities in the next minute that they might never have thought of. And so it's not the idea of 1 minute mindfulness is that if you're going to do mindfulness, you can only really do it in this next minute, in the next 60 seconds, and that the next 60 seconds are really that's really the time that matters in your life. And how you decide to use your awareness and your intention in this next 60 seconds can make a major difference from maybe experiencing things in a way that you might be feeling miserable to maybe turning your attention in a nourishing way and where you could feel joy or where you could feel hopeful, for example.
Yeah, you can really transform your engagement with the present moment. And that's one of the things I liked best about this book. It really two things. I'm going to read just one quote from it here. This is early on in the book. Is that by fostering a curious, compassionate, and open-hearted awareness in each moment, we can be blessed with clarity, joy, peace, love, and wisdom, while also reducing our suffering and the suffering of others. To be alive is to be totally and openly participate in the simplicity and elegance of here and now. And what I like about that and the focus of the book on just this 1 minute is it's challenging sometimes for us to think about, oh yeah, I gotta sit for 40 minutes. That's a little bit harder for many of us to do it, and we find excuses to not do so. But if you say, really, it's just this minute that really pushes our focus where it needs to be anyway, whether you're going to sit for 40 minutes or 10 or 5, it's really focused on the present moment. And that helps.
Still dealing with this minute right before you.
Right, yeah. Exactly. And you also, at the end of each chapter, you have a separate dialogue on practice where you give a specific exercise for people to do.
My intention there was to help people start to see new ways that they could use this material and to actually begin to it's almost like those pictures you see in kids magazine or kids books with coloring books with all the dots, and you connect the dots and there's numbers that's what this is like. So you connect the dots in your home life in different ways, or you connect the dots when you wake up in the morning and waking up to noticing that first taste of the morning, or the last taste of the day, or at work starting to notice different things, relationships that you're having with people. And so you're using the 1 minute mindfulness in all these little different areas. And before you're long, you're starting to become mindful more and more of the day. And you're starting to notice maybe when you're not being mindful. And so and finally the whole picture starts to be drawn. And I think that this could lead to a greater interest in doing more sitting work or deepening the mindful or the meditative practice in other ways as well.
Yeah, it does, and you do describe that very well in very pragmatic terms. And one of the things I did want to touch on as well is that you talk in the book about various rituals that we have. And one of the things I wanted to make sure people listening to this understand is the way you mean rituals is not in a supernatural connotation.
Oh, right.
The way you mean ritual is a regular practice that helps foster what we're doing. Tell us just a little bit about that and the importance of having personal rituals.
When I think about ritual, I think about not a not a mindless ritual, something that you do without thinking, or you come in and you put your keys down on a particular spot, but a conscious ritual, a purposeful ritual. And an example of that would be how do I treat my family? How do I treat the morning around those that I'm with? How do I say goodbye to my family, right? And really putting some thought into how I want to interact, because rituals of goodbye and hello are really quite important in relationships. As a therapist, when I've worked with couples who are having problems, and I say, what is one little thing that you would like to have the other person do? Almost invariably has to do with, I want a good night kiss or a hug, or I want him or her to get out of the bed, give me a hug at the door or something, but some connection. And that can be a very important ritual that includes touch or a kind word or a smile and encouragement. And then you can think about, even at the workplace, you could have little rituals that you could create that are meaningful, not mindless, but meaningful. And they're like little signposts throughout the day that make your day memorable. Yeah, it's funny the way I think mindfulness is really about helping the brain remember the good things, because the brain is kind of like it's kind of like Velcro for negativity, and it's designed that if something bad happens, you remember it, and you could have because as a survival, it's kind of a survival wiring that if something bad happens, you want to avoid it again. So the memory will be very strong in that area. But it takes, and that can happen in 30 seconds, right, a negative memory. But it takes about a lot longer to create a positive memory. And I think what mindfulness does is it really helps focus you on remembering and really paying attention to the good, decent things that life has, and all the little things that happen each moment, so that at the end of the day, you could really feel this was a very special day, even though nothing momentous happened, right? But you were paying attention to the little things, and that's extremely powerful and beautiful, and that alone rewires your brain into doing more of that.
It does, and we see this in neurological studies and many guests that we've had on the podcast, that we see there are physical changes in the brain, that we are capitalizing on the brain's plasticity based on our practice.
Right.
And the sincerity of those moments make a very big difference. I think that in the evolution of human beings, we've, of course, our survival was dependent on us noticing bad and dangerous things and avoiding them. And our survival was less dependent on noticing and enjoying the relaxed, low stress moments. So we have millions of years of evolution that's that's encouraging us to really latch on to those bad experiences.
Yeah, and we have more sustained perpetual stress than we ever used to have.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also the sincerity of those moments make a very big difference. That there was a talk that I went to at a local meditation center, and the speaker was a guest speaker, was not one of the regular teachers there. And as the person who sets up the mic was, setting up the table and all of that, they had something of a habit of, they would bow to the person, and whoever was the regular speaker would just sort of, bow to them as a reflex, not even really being aware of it. And this guest speaker didn't do that. They they bowed with full sincerity in that moment, and they made eye contact, and they were genuinely grateful for this little assistance in setting things up, and you could tell it was very touching and meaningful to the receiver, the person who was helping out, because of they just lightened visibly, and they smiled and were much more engaged in the rest of the talk, because here was someone who was being genuine with them.
I think that really what the mindfulness practices can help us do is really, I think you did mention the word, is really help us evolve our brain, not just individually, but in a shared way, collectively and with others, to reach toward that greater potential that we have within us as human beings, in which what I saw in Uthilananda, the monk I was telling you about. And we know that these practices do change the physical structure of the brain, and we have this incredible ability and power to focus in that way. So where you use your attention is critical, because when you look around the world, and everybody's trying to get your attention. It's the most precious thing you may have, and everybody wants a piece of that. And what I wanted to do with 1 Minute Mindfulness is to help people get collected with their attention and to bring it back, and then be more cognizant of how they're using it in the moment. And let them be the ones who are deciding how they want to use it. And is this how? I have a lot of different questions, and I don't know if you noticed that in the book, but there's also this contemplative aspect that I thought was important for 1 Minute Mindfulness, was that we could pause, and there are different chapters where I ask readers to ask a series of questions to themselves. And that I think we need those moments of like 1 minute just to pause, just to step back and ask some reflective questions about how do we want to respond right here, or am I really, am I locked in an old mindset, or am I looking at this moment in a fresh way?
And just the act of asking a question helps separate us in that moment from whatever the activity is that we normally are, unfortunately, perhaps in a not good way, participating in, that we identify with it as a self, as my thoughts or whatever. But this helps create a little bit of space. And in particular, if we take just a moment to ask that question, we've created even more space, which is an even greater opportunity for us to make better decisions.
My hope with this book is that people would get it and use it and share it with others, and even do book groups where they can start exploring experiences that they've had. And I think that's another way that, it's almost like a Sangha, right?
Yeah.
Sangha book group, but the secular Sangha book group.
We'll use community. Yeah, we'll use community.
yeah, that's good. I like that.
Well, we have been speaking with Donald Altman, and the book we've been chatting about is it just came out, 1 Minute Mindfulness. And if you'd like to find out more about that, there's also a website specifically for this that is www.1minutemindfulnessbook.com. And again, that is linked, as well as the Center for Mindful Eating site, on the episode page for this episode. Donald, I really appreciate you spending time with us today.
Oh, thanks, Ted. It was a joy for me. And anybody can write me, and if you have any comments about this podcast or about the book or anything about mindfulness, please, you can email me, and that is on the website too.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.